The Wolf King treated her as a substitute. After she left, he regretted losing her. The kingdom lay under a sky painted in gray and violet, where the sun never fully rose and the mist rolled over the cliffs like restless spirits. At the heart of this land stood the fortress of the Wolf King, a structure as old and wild as the forests surrounding it. Jagged stone spires pierced the clouds, and from the walls came the faint echo of howls, wolves that roamed free, bound only to the will of their master. Alara walked through the fog-laden road that led to the fortress, her cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders. She was a healer by trade, known in her village for her gentle hands and steady heart. Yet as she neared the gates of the Wolf King's castle, she felt a coldness unlike anything she had ever known. The air itself seemed to whisper warnings, and the trees bent as if bowing in fear. She was not sure why she had come. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was fate. The summons from the Wolf King had arrived without explanation, carried by a raven with eyes black as midnight. It simply read, "Come to the fortress. The kingdom needs your hands." The gates creaked open before she could knock, and a servant in dark velvet led her into a hall that smelled of smoke and iron. Candles flickered along the walls, their light casting strange shadows that danced like creatures from another world. "Wait here," the servant said, his voice low, almost afraid. Then he vanished, leaving her alone in the vast chamber. Alara's heart beat faster. She had heard stories about the Wolf King, stories of his cruelty, of the wolves that obeyed him as though they were an extension of his will, of the king who trusted no one and feared no one. Yet something in those tales did not frighten her entirely. Perhaps it was the sense of sorrow that clung to his name, something raw and human hiding beneath the darkness. The doors at the far end of the hall opened slowly. A man stepped out, tall and commanding, cloaked in black that seemed to swallow the candlelight around him. His eyes were sharp, like steel glinting in shadow, and his hair fell in wild strands over a pale, stern face. The room seemed smaller in his presence, as if the walls themselves bowed to him. "I am Kale," he said, his voice deep, carrying both authority and something else, something that hinted at pain. "You are the healer who comes to my court," Alara bowed, keeping her gaze steady. "Yes, your majesty, I was sent here to help, though I do not know the cause." Kale's lips pressed into a thin line. He studied her silently, his sharp gaze flicking over her face and hands as though weighing her worth. "I am ill," he said finally. "The healers of this castle have failed. I do not know if you will succeed where they have not." Alara swallowed her fear. "I will do my best, my lord." Kale nodded once and turned, his cloak trailing behind him. He walked with a fluid grace that reminded her of the wolves she had heard howling outside the walls. Without another word, he led her through the fortress, past darkened halls, up spiraling stairs, and into a chamber lined with ancient tapestries. The room was empty except for a bed and a table covered with herbs, bottles, and scrolls. Kale seated himself in a high-backed chair and gestured for her to begin. Alara worked silently, examining his condition. It was not a physical illness that plagued him, she realized, but a shadow that weighed on his spirit. His face bore the mark of someone who had lost everything yet refused to yield. His eyes, sharp as a wolf's, occasionally softened when he thought no one was looking. She spoke softly, more to fill the silence than to explain her actions. "Your hands are cold. Your pulse is strong, but your body carries tension, as if your heart fights a weight only it can bear." Kale did not answer immediately. His eyes followed her hands as they moved over the herbs, over the small bowls of water and oils. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost vulnerable. "You see more than I expected." Alara paused. "It is hard not to see. The pain in a person leaves traces. Even the strongest walls show cracks eventually." Kale's gaze sharpened, a flicker of something like curiosity in his eyes. For a moment, the coldness he carried seemed to waver, and Alara felt the stirrings of a connection neither of them fully understood. Days passed, and Alara's presence became both a comfort and a thorn. She tended to Kale with quiet patience, and he allowed her into the parts of himself he had kept locked away. Yet always, there was the shadow of the woman he had lost, the queen who had been more than life to him. Alara knew she was a substitute, a reminder of what had been, though she tried not to think of it. Kale treated her with the same restraint he showed to the world, measured words, calculated distance. Yet sometimes, when he thought no one watched, his gaze lingered on her. He noticed the way she moved, the gentle determination in her eyes, the warmth she carried despite the chill of the castle. One night, a storm broke over the kingdom. Rain lashed the windows and wind moaned through the stone halls. Alara found herself standing near the window, watching the lightning trace the forest in jagged silver. Kale appeared behind her, silent as the shadows. "The storm is fierce," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost a whisper. Alara nodded. "It is nothing compared to the darkness in this place, yet even storms pass." Kale's gaze met hers. In that moment the distance between them seemed to vanish, and the memory of the queen, the pain of loss, all seemed to blur. He wanted to speak, to confess the ache he felt at having someone so alive in a world so cold, but the words failed him. Instead, he turned away, leaving her with the storm and her racing heart. Alara's nights were restless. She slept in a small room near the chamber, yet she could not silence the thoughts of him. The way he carried his solitude like armor, the flicker of loneliness in his eyes that mirrored her own. She did not dare hope. She reminded herself constantly. She was a substitute, a shadow of a woman lost. Anything more was impossible. And yet fate has a way of bending the impossible. A week passed and Kale summoned her to the chamber. He did not speak of illness or healing. Instead, he asked her to walk with him in the moonlit courtyard. The sky was clear now, and the cold air bit at their faces, but there was a strange beauty in the silence between them. "You have stayed despite knowing what you are to me," Kale said finally, his voice softer than it had ever been. "I am not easy to serve, not easy to care for." Alara met his eyes, steadying her own heart. "I do not serve you because of your title or your power," she said. "I am here because it is my choice, and because I see who you are, not who you were or what you have lost." Kale's hands clenched into fists at his sides, a storm inside him as fierce as the one outside days ago. He wanted to reach for her, to bridge the gap of loneliness that had haunted him for years. Yet he feared doing so would betray the memory of the queen, and he feared losing control over the emotions she stirred. "I do not know if I can be what you see," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I am the Wolf King, feared and hated. You see me differently. That is dangerous." Alara stepped closer, though she kept a cautious distance. "We are all dangerous in our own ways," she said softly. "But we are also capable of hope. You are not alone unless you choose to be." For a long moment they stood in silence. The wind rustled through the courtyard, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and pine. And then, as though the world held its breath, Kale spoke again. "Perhaps," he said, voice low and uncertain, "you are not a substitute at all. Perhaps you are something I have forgotten how to feel." Alara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She knew the truth of what he said. He was beginning to see her as herself, not as a shadow of another. And in that truth lay danger, for once a bond of the heart began, it could not be easily undone. The night deepened, and the moon cast long silver shadows over the courtyard. Alara knew she could not stay in the castle forever. The stories of the Wolf King's solitude and sorrow were not lies, were warnings. And yet the pull she felt toward him was undeniable. Before dawn, she made a decision. She would leave the castle. She would leave the Wolf King, even if it broke her heart, for she could not live as a substitute, and she could not bear to watch him struggle with her presence as a reminder of what he had lost. She left quietly, slipping through the corridors and out into the forest beyond the castle walls. The wind embraced her as she ran, and the first rays of morning light began to pierce the mist. Cale awoke that morning to find her gone. The emptiness in the bed, the coldness of the room, the echo of her absence, it struck him like a blade. For the first time in years he felt fear, raw and unrelenting. He realized that he had lost more than a healer, more than a companion. He had lost someone who had begun to awaken the part of him he thought dead. And in that loss, Cale understood the truth he had been avoiding. He had treated her as a substitute, but she had been more than that all along. And now she was gone. The fortress fell silent, save for the distant howls of wolves mourning in the forests below. And Cale, standing alone, felt the first taste of regret, bitter and unyielding, gnawing at his heart. Cliffhanger. Somewhere in the misty forest, Elara paused to rest. She did not know what fate awaited her or the Wolf King she left behind. But the wind carried a warning, a whisper of destiny. The Wolf King would come for her. The forest stretched endlessly before Elara, a sea of shadows and silver moonlight. Mist curled around the trees like silent ghosts, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. She moved carefully, her cloak brushing against ferns and fallen leaves. Every step carried the weight of her decision to leave the Wolf King's fortress, and yet the farther she went, the heavier her heart felt. She had thought distance would bring clarity, but it only deepened the ache. Cale's words, soft and hesitant in the moonlit courtyard, echoed in her mind. "Perhaps you are, something I have forgotten how to feel." Elara shook her head, trying to push them away. She had chosen to leave, not because she did not care, but because she could not remain a substitute for someone who mourned another. She needed to be herself, free from shadows of the past. Yet the forest itself seemed to test her resolve. A rustle in the trees made her freeze. Her hands instinctively clutched her satchel of herbs and bandages, though she did not expect danger. The forest, she realized, was alive in ways that were older than kings and queens, older than the Wolf King himself. From the mist emerged a figure, tall and cloaked in darkness, with eyes that glimmered like pale stars. Elara's breath caught. "You should not wander here alone," the figure said. His voice was low, like the wind through branches. Elara's pulse quickened, yet there was something familiar in the voice. She squinted through the fog and realized it was not a stranger, it was Cale. His hair was damp from the night air, his cloak clinging to his broad shoulders, and his wolf-like presence seemed even more commanding in the forest. "Cale," she whispered, both relief and fear rising in her chest. "How did you?" He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I feared losing you," he said simply. "I could not bear to wake to find the emptiness where you should have been." Elara lowered her gaze. "I had to leave. I could not be what you expected, a shadow of your queen. That is not who I am." Cale's expression softened just slightly, though the sharpness in his eyes never vanished. "I know," he said, "but I also know now that I have treated you wrongly. You are not a substitute. You are you." For a moment the forest seemed to hold its breath. The mist hung thicker, the trees bending closer as if listening. There was a vulnerability in Cale she had never seen before, a fracture in the armor of the Wolf King. Elara began, then stopped. Words failed her. She wanted to tell him everything she felt, the longing and fear, but the fear of being replaced, or of becoming a replacement, kept her silent. Cale took a step closer. "There is something I must show you," he said. "Something that cannot wait in the castle." Before she could question him, he turned and led her deeper into the forest. The trees thickened, and the moonlight barely touched the ground. Strange symbols carved into the bark glowed faintly as they passed, marking an old magic that hummed with life. They arrived at a clearing where the ground was littered with silver leaves and wildflowers that shimmered in the pale light. In the center stood a stone altar, ancient and worn, covered in moss and vine. Cale stepped up to it, placing a hand on the cold surface. "This," he said, his voice low, "is where my family's curse began. It binds me to the wolf that I become at night, keeps me chained to my solitude, and reminds me daily of the loss I cannot escape." Alara stepped forward, her fingers brushing the stone. The air around it thrummed with power, a pulse that mirrored her own heartbeat. "Can it be broken?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale looked at her, his eyes intense. "Perhaps, but it is dangerous. The curse has been here for centuries, and no mortal has ever survived the trials it demands." Alara met his gaze, courage rising despite the fear. "Then we face it together. I will not run, and neither will you." Kale's lips pressed into a thin line, his usual restraint returning. He knew the path ahead would be perilous, yet something about her, her bravery, her refusal to be a shadow, ignited a spark in him that he had not felt in years. As they prepared to confront the curse, the forest shifted. Shadows lengthened, forming shapes that moved with intent. Spirits, long trapped in the land, rose to challenge them. Ghostly forms circled the clearing, their faces twisted in silent sorrow. Kale stepped protectively in front of Alara, his posture commanding. "Do not fear them," he said. "They are bound to the land, not to us, but they will test us." The spirits advanced, and Kale's wolf instincts flared. His senses sharpened. He could hear the whisper of the wind, smell the tension in the air, and feel the pulse of danger like a drumbeat in his chest. Alara, too, felt the power around her, but she did not falter. She raised her hands, chanting softly with the herbs she carried, weaving the energy of the forest into a protective circle around them. The spirits recoiled at her presence, hissing and moaning, their forms flickering like dying stars. Kale watched her, astonished. "You are stronger than I imagined," he admitted, "not just in skill but in spirit." Alara smiled faintly, though fear still lingered in her chest. "I have no choice but to be strong, and you don't hide behind your darkness forever." Kale's eyes darkened with a mixture of regret and longing. "I do not know how to be anything but what I am," he said, voice low. "The wolf is part of me, so is the shadow of my queen. I do not know where I end and they begin." She reached out, lightly touching his arm. The contact was simple, yet it carried more meaning than words. "Then let me help you find where you end and I begin, together." The spirits, as if recognizing the bond forming between them, retreated. The forest quieted, though the air remained thick with magic. Kale exhaled, a sound that was half relief, half something darker, something that had been locked away for decades. "You risk yourself for me," he said, his voice rough. "Why?" Alara looked into his eyes, steady despite the fear. "Because I choose to. Because I see the man beneath the wolf and I cannot ignore him. And because I care." Kale's chest tightened. Care. The word felt foreign, almost dangerous, yet it made his heart ache with longing. He wanted to speak, to tell her that she was more than he deserved, that she could leave and he would understand, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he offered her his hand. "Then we face the next trial together," he said. The night deepened. In the clearing, the altar began to glow faintly, ancient runes lighting one by one as if acknowledging their courage. A chill swept through the air, carrying whispers of old promises and warnings. Kale and Alara stepped forward together, knowing that the path ahead would test not only their strength but their hearts. Suddenly, a shadow darker than night fell over the clearing. The ground trembled and the trees groaned. A figure emerged from the mist, a wolf larger than any natural beast, its eyes glowing with an unnatural fire. It was Kale's true wolf form, bound by the curse he had carried for so long. Kale stepped in front of Alara, instinctively protective. The wolf growled, low and deep, circling him with the power of the curse made flesh. Kale's control wavered, the wolf's instincts pulsed within him, threatening to overwhelm reason. Alara did not falter. She raised her voice, soft and commanding, and the herbs in her hands glowed with the light of the forest's magic. "Kale," she said firmly, "you are stronger than this curse. I am here. You are not alone." For a heartbeat, the wolf hesitated, as if hearing her words in the wind. Then slowly, Kale's human form emerged from the beast, trembling but present. He fell to his knees, breathing heavily, his eyes dark with struggle and relief. Alara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You are not a prisoner," she whispered. "You are more than the wolf, more than your sorrow. You are yourself." Kale looked at her, his chest heaving, and for the first time in years he felt the stirrings of hope. Yet beneath that hope lay fear, the fear of losing her, the fear of failing, and the knowledge that the curse was not fully broken. Alara helped him to his feet, and they stood together, framed by the silver moonlight and the misty forest. Though danger still lurked and the trials were far from over, they had taken the first step. Together. Cliffhanger. As dawn approached, the mist shifted once more, revealing a shadow in the far distance, a figure watching them, unseen but not unknown. Its presence carried a warning. The journey of the Wolf King and the healer had only just begun, and the forest held more secrets than either could imagine. The sun was only a pale glow behind the thick mist that clung to the forest, casting silver and gray shadows over the earth. Alara and Kale walked slowly through the dense undergrowth, their hands brushing at times, though neither spoke. The events of the previous night still lingered, heavy in their hearts. Kale had faced his wolf form with her help, but the curse was far from defeated. It pulsed through his veins like a quiet storm, waiting for a chance to reclaim him. Alara could feel it, too, the dark weight that still clung to him, the invisible chains of grief and power that no human hand could untangle. Yet she did not falter. She had made her choice, to stand beside him, not as a substitute, but as someone who belonged to herself and to him. They arrived at a hidden glade, known only to the oldest stories of the forest. Ancient trees formed a natural arch overhead, their roots entwining like living bridges. In the center of the glade lay a pool of still water, reflecting the moonlight even in the early morning. The air smelled of moss and wet stone, and the whispers of the forest seemed to hush in anticipation. "This is the heart of the forest," Kale said quietly. "Here the curse is strongest. I have never come here willingly, for it forces a truth even I cannot hide." Alara knelt by the pool, dipping her hands into the cool water. "Then this is where we begin," she said. "Together." Kale watched her, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at her calm resolve. Yet beneath the surface, the wolf inside him stirred, restless and eager. He had learned to control it at times, but the curse had its own will, and tonight it would test him as never before. The forest grew darker, though the moon hung high, casting silver paths through the mist. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the wind whispered through the trees in voices that seemed almost human. Kale stepped forward, his bare feet touching the ground lightly, every sense alert. "Do not fear me if I falter," he said, his voice low. "The wolf is not gone. It waits and it will test us." Alara looked into his eyes, her own steady and unwavering. "I do not fear what you are," she said. "I see what you can be. Let me help you." The first trial began as the ground beneath them trembled. Roots of the ancient trees rose like serpents, twisting and coiling around their feet. Kale's wolf instincts surged, a growl escaping his throat despite himself. His eyes flashed gold for a moment, and the air around him felt alive with power. Alara did not move back. Instead, she pressed her palms to the roots, murmuring softly in the old language of the forest, a tongue that had been passed down in whispers for generations. The roots recoiled, leaving a path clear to the pool. "You are remarkable," Kale admitted, his voice heavy with awe. "You face what even I fear." She smiled faintly, though worry flickered in her chest. "I face it because you are worth it, because you are not alone." Kale's breath caught at her words. They were simple, yet they carried more meaning than any title or command could. For a man who had ruled through fear and solitude for decades, her faith in him was a revelation, and it frightened him almost as much as it moved him. They reached the pool, and Kale knelt beside it. The water shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not just their faces but flickers of the past. The queen he had lost, the moments of isolation, the nights when the wolf had dominated his mind. Each vision was a test, forcing him to confront memories he had long buried. Alara reached for his hand and he flinched at first but then allowed her touch. Her fingers were warm, grounding him, tethering him to the present. "You are stronger than your past," she whispered. "Stronger than the wolf, stronger than grief. Do not let it control you." Kale's chest heaved, and for a moment the gold in his eyes deepened, threatening to consume the human within. But Alara's presence was steady, unyielding. She did not flinch, did not hesitate. She simply remained, a beacon in the storm of his inner chaos. The water of the pool began to ripple, responding to their courage. Shapes emerged, visions of Kale's ancestors, men and women who had carried the same curse, their faces filled with sorrow and regret. They spoke without words, urging him to confront the wolf within, to choose humanity over instinct. Kale's hands clenched into fists. "I have failed them," he muttered, his voice thick with pain. "I am bound by their mistakes, by their choices, and by my own." Alara pressed her palm to his chest. "Then let us break the cycle," she said firmly. "Together." The wind surged through the glade, tossing leaves and silver petals into the air. Kale's wolf form began to rise, shimmering at the edges, threatening to take control. Yet he did not resist Alara's hand. He did not push her away. Instead, he let himself feel, let himself lean into the trust they had begun to build. A flash of light erupted from the pool, blinding and pure. Kale cried out as the wolf surged within him, but Alara held firm. She chanted, drawing the magic of the forest, the energy of the ancient pool, and the strength of her own will into a circle around them. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Kale's breath was ragged, his hands shaking, but slowly the gold in his eyes faded. The wolf withdrew, leaving the man beneath. He collapsed to the ground, trembling but alive. Alara knelt beside him, supporting his weight. "You did it," she whispered. "You are yourself again." Kale looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and relief. I did not think it was possible," he admitted. "I have lived for decades under this curse, and I thought it would always control me." "You are stronger than the curse," Alara said simply. "Stronger than fear, stronger than loss. You are not alone anymore." For the first time in years, Kale allowed himself to lean into her. He did not touch her as a king commanding a subject, nor as a wolf asserting dominance. He touched her as a man who had finally found someone willing to see him, not as a shadow of another, but as himself. The forest seemed to exhale with them, the mist parting to reveal the pale light of dawn. Birds began to sing, their voices tentative but hopeful. The world felt quieter, softer, as if it had been waiting for this moment of balance and trust. Yet even in the peace, the shadows remained. The curse had been weakened, but it was not gone. Kale knew that other forces, unseen and ancient, still watched. The forest held more secrets, more tests that would come to challenge their bond. Alara helped him to his feet, and they stood together at the edge of the pool. Their hands brushed again, this time without hesitation. The connection between them was no longer one of fear or uncertainty. It was trust, fragile but real, built through trial and courage. "You have changed," Kale said softly, "not just because of the curse, but because you face it. You face me." Alara smiled, a faint curve of hope in her lips. "We face it together, and there is still more to face." Kale's gaze darkened with determination. "Then we will face it together," he repeated. "No shadows, no wolves, no fear, just us." The forest remained silent, though the wind carried whispers of old magic. Kale and Alara walked back toward the hidden paths, knowing that the journey was far from over. They had survived the first true trial, but the next challenge would test more than strength or courage. It would test the heart, the bond between them, and the choices they were willing to make for one another. As they left the glade, Kale paused and looked back. The water shimmered, reflecting not just the forest but faint images of a kingdom in turmoil, of shadows that still lingered, and of a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. "I will not let the curse take me again," he said, more to himself than to her. "And I will not let you leave." Alara's heart skipped a beat. "I will not leave," she said softly, "but you must also let me be myself, not a replacement, not a shadow, just me." Kale nodded, a new understanding in his eyes. "Then we are equals," he said, his voice firm. "And nothing, not curse, nor shadow, nor fear, will break that." The mist began to lift as dawn approached, casting golden light over the treetops. For a brief moment the forest seemed at peace. Yet somewhere in the distance a presence watched, silent and patient. It was a reminder that the trials were not over, that the world held deeper mysteries and dangers, and that their bond would be tested again. Cliffhanger. As Alara and Kale emerged from the forest, a dark figure stood at the edge of the trees, observing them with eyes that glimmered like fire. Its intentions were unknown, but its presence carried a warning. The transformation was only the beginning, and the true test of their hearts had yet to come. The kingdom had changed. The mist that had once clung to the cliffs and forests now hovered lighter, as though sensing the shift in its ruler. The fortress of the Wolf King, long silent and foreboding, seemed to breathe with a new rhythm, its walls less oppressive, its shadows less threatening. Yet even in the calm, tension lingered, whispers of curses, of unseen powers, and of destiny yet unmet. Kale stood on the balcony of the highest tower, his cloak drawn around his shoulders, the wind tugging at his hair. His eyes scanned the horizon, restless and watchful. He had survived the trials of the forest with Alara, but the wolf within him still stirred occasionally, a reminder of the darkness that had always been part of him. He had learned to trust himself and to trust her. That was the greatest gift and the greatest risk. For in loving someone, he realized, one did not merely protect, they also opened their heart to pain, to fear, and to hope beyond measure. Alara approached quietly, her boots soft against the stone floor. She had become a steady presence in his life, no longer a substitute, no longer a shadow. She was herself, vibrant and unafraid, and yet still gentle, carrying the strength of the forest in her hands and the courage of her own choices in her heart. "You are thinking too far ahead," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "You cannot control everything, Kale. Not the kingdom, not the wolf, not the future." Kale's jaw tightened. "I have spent years controlling everything I could. But there are forces that I cannot contain, and now I fear what will happen if I fail you or if I fail myself." Alara reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Then do not fail alone. We face it together. You are not alone anymore." He looked at her, really looked, and the weight of decades lifted slightly from his shoulders. "I once thought I was destined to walk in solitude," he admitted, "to rule without warmth, to love without hope, but you have changed that." She smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curving with warmth. "We have changed that together." The calm did not last. From the edge of the forest came a ripple of darkness, a presence that neither Kale nor Alara had expected. The watcher from the glade had followed them, its eyes burning like coals in the growing daylight. It stepped forward, revealing itself as a figure cloaked in black, moving with purpose and silent authority. "You have grown strong," the figure said, voice echoing with unnatural resonance. "Stronger than I imagined, but strength alone does not break curses. Only the heart can do that, and the heart is fragile." Kale stepped protectively in front of Alara, his body tense, ready to defend her. "Who are you?" he demanded. "And what do you want?" The figure lifted its hood, revealing a pale, angular face. Eyes like molten gold studied them both. "I am the keeper of the ancient curse," it said. "I have watched generations rise and fall under its weight. You, Wolf King, and you, Healer, have challenged its power. Now comes the final reckoning." Alara did not flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her hands glowing faintly with the magic of the forest. "We do not fear the curse," she said firmly. "We face it, and we face it together." The keeper nodded slowly, as though measuring their courage. Then, with a motion of its hand, the ground beneath them trembled. Shadows rose from the stone floor, twisting into forms of wolves, each larger and more fearsome than the last. They circled Kale, growling and snapping, reflections of the wolf he had once been, the fury he had contained and the darkness he still carried. Kale's wolf instincts surged, the familiar pull threatening to dominate. He felt the strength in the circle of shadows, the temptation to surrender to instinct rather than reason. Yet Alara's hand on his arm grounded him. "You are not alone," she repeated. "You are more than the wolf, more than the shadow, more than the pain. You are Kale. Remember who you are." He closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath. The golden flash of the wolf in his eyes appeared briefly, then faded as he forced the instinct into submission. One by one, the shadow wolves dissolved, leaving only the echo of their howls in the air. The keeper's eyes narrowed. "You have strength," it said, voice low and wary. "But strength without love cannot break what binds you. The final test is the heart." Kale looked at Alara, feeling the weight of centuries pressing upon him. The wolf, the curse, the loss of the queen, they had shaped him, hardened him, and haunted him. But in her eyes he saw reflection not of what he had been, but of what he could be. Courage, trust, and redemption intertwined in a single moment, fragile yet brilliant. He took her hands in his, feeling the warmth of her skin, the steady beat of life that had been his anchor through the darkest trials. "I do not deserve you," he whispered, voice rough. "Not yet, but I will fight to deserve you." Alara's eyes softened. "You do not need to deserve me. You only need to be yourself, and that is enough." The keeper watched silently as they stood together, hand in hand, their courage and trust radiating outward. Slowly, the shadows of the curse began to crack, lines of silver light spreading across Kale's body, illuminating the man beneath the wolf. His golden eyes, once a mark of the curse, now glimmered with human warmth and resolve. The forest beyond the fortress seemed to respond, a chorus of whispers carrying approval, the wind lifting the mist, and the sun piercing through clouds to cast a golden hue over the land. The curse that had haunted the Wolf King for generations was breaking, not through magic alone, but through love, courage, and acceptance. Kale fell to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. Alara knelt beside him, supporting his weight. For a moment they simply sat in silence, the world holding its breath. Then Kale looked at her, the shadow of fear replaced with gratitude and something deeper, hope. "You stayed," he said softly. "Through everything you stayed." "I could not leave," Alara replied. "Not when you needed someone to see the real you, not when I saw who you could be." Kale reached for her face, cradling it gently. "I have wronged you before," he admitted, "treated you as a substitute, as a shadow of another, but I see now you are yourself. And I," his voice faltered, thick with emotion, "I am yours if you will have me." Alara's hand rose to rest over his heart, feeling the steady beat, the echo of struggle and survival. "And I am yours," she said simply. "Not because of what you were, but because of who you are now." The keeper, silent for so long, stepped back. "The heart has spoken," it said. "The curse is broken. You have proven that redemption is not born of power or fear, but of courage, trust, and love." With a final nod, the figure vanished into the mist, leaving Kale and Alara alone in the dawn-lit fortress. The first true sunlight in decades fell across the walls, glinting off the stone and illuminating the kingdom in golden warmth. Kale rose, standing tall and human, unshackled from the wolf's dominance, yet carrying its strength in measured balance. He took Alara's hand, and together they walked through the halls of the fortress, their footsteps echoing differently than before, lighter, freer, and yet resonant with newfound purpose. The people of the kingdom noticed the change. Wolves no longer prowled the walls with menace. Instead, they roamed with loyalty and calm. The mist that had shrouded the cliffs began to lift, revealing the jagged beauty of the lands, fertile and wild. And at the heart of it all stood the Wolf King and the Healer, united not by duty, not by expectation, but by choice and understanding. They spent days walking the forests, tending to the wounded and neglected creatures, and rebuilding trust with the people. Kale's rule became one of justice tempered with compassion, and Alara's presence reminded him daily that strength was not measured by fear, but by the willingness to love and to be loved in return. Yet even in peace, Kale remained vigilant. He had faced the shadows of his past and survived, but he knew that darkness was never truly gone. What mattered was not the absence of darkness, but the courage to face it, hand in hand with someone who believed in him. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Kale and Alara stood on the balcony of the fortress. The wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, and the wolves below howled softly, a song of loyalty and freedom. "You have changed me," Kale said quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant forest. "Not just the curse, but everything. I see now that life is not meant to be endured alone." Alara smiled, leaning against him. "And you have changed me too. I came to heal, but I found something I did not expect: hope, courage, and you." Kale turned to her, taking her hands in his. "Then we begin again," he said. "Together, not as king and healer, not as master and substitute, but as equals, bound by choice, not by fear." Alara's eyes shimmered in the fading light. "Together," she agreed. And so the Wolf King and the healer stood side by side, the curse behind them, the kingdom before them, and the future uncertain but bright. For the first time in decades, Kale felt the warmth of dawn not just on his skin, but in his heart, and he knew that redemption was not a destination, but a journey, and one worth traveling, hand in hand with the one he loved.